Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us for this episode of Right Circle, which is presented by Shri Cements, organized by Siahi, and it's done in association with Prabha Ketan Foundation, SAS Women and Spagia Foundation. Just a couple of house rules before I introduce our speakers for this evening. We will be giving away a copy of Ira's book to all of you who are attending. So please send your addresses in the next 48 hours to the following number. It's 9958312427. I will repeat this number at the end of the session also, just in case you missed out on it right now. But without further delay, I'm really, really excited to introduce the speaker for today is Ira Mukhoty. Ira, we've been trying to get you to speak for Right Circle, and we also had plans to invite you to the 11th edition of Mountain Echoes, which obviously didn't happen in Bhutan, but I promise I'm going to make up for that one. But going back to Ira Mukhoty, who is probably one of the most well-known, acclaimed historian writers of our times. She kind of burst into the firmament with her book Akbar, the Great Mughal, and then she followed up with Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens, and Begums of the Mughal Empire, and then Heroines, powerful women, Indian women in myth and history. So you can imagine that she has a very deep connection with mythology and history, and also with the relevance and importance and significance of the role played by women and the status that they did or did not enjoy. Her latest book is Song of Draupadi, which is her first novel. With that, a very warm welcome to you, Ira. And moderating her today is Manjot Chawla, who has, well, apart from being a very, very dear friend and very much a cultural icon in our city, in Jaipur, she has a lot of experience curating and planning and producing a lot of cultural events internationally and nationally. She's done festivals, she's given birth to cultural festivals, which have become an annual feature through Seher in Delhi. And she's also helped Siahi with some of our projects in Bhutan. And there's a lot of things that she's done across the world. As far as music is concerned, her forte is from classical to sacred to jazz to anything modern. So I've seen Manjot dip her fingers in a lot of things to do with music, with culture. And she's right now also promoting miniature artists from Jaipur through her brand called Gemini. So with that, I'm going to leave and mute myself and also disappear from the screen and hand over the session to Ira and Manjot. A very warm welcome to all of you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Meeta. Hi, Ira. Welcome once again. And it is such a delight to be doing this with you. I was first a little apprehensive because I was like, so much of history that you've written that, but then I said that, no, I'd love to do this and I'm sure it'll be fun. So basically we'll start with your beginning because of course, I know that you've studied science and you have a strong background in science, and it was intriguing when I discovered that from science you shifted to writing, and that to history. I mean, how did that happen, and what really pulled you out of science? Because when we're growing up, tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon, Manjot, and thank you to the Right Circle for organizing this. And yes, I think people find it very intriguing, my background. And so all I can say is that when I was growing up, and when you were a more or less capable student, at the time when I was a kid, there was really, you were always urged to join the sciences. The arts wasn't really an option if you were a good student. At that time, it was like, science, do science and you'll be fine in life. And the problem with me is I liked sciences and I liked the arts. I liked both. So actually, what would have suited me would have been a liberal arts program where I could have done a bit of everything, which is more acceptable, luckily, in today's day and age. But I was sort of encouraged to go into the sciences. I did the sciences. I did 5 years post-grad. And then I worked for a while in pharmaceutical research as well. And eventually found that it wasn't something that I enjoyed doing, and I kept up this love of the arts of reading, especially. And I wanted to write. Writing was something that really appealed to me. And so it was actually a very accidental process, my entry into the writing world, is that I had stopped work for a while. I was raising 2 small children. And it was during that process of raising 2 small girls in India that I started looking around. And you know how we are these days as extra hands-on parents. We want to give them the right things to read, the right stories. We want to shape their inner mind as well, And so I was looking for good stories, for good Indian women stories as role models for them as little girls. And I was looking around, and a lot at that time, especially, there was a lot of mythology around. There's a lot of Ramayana, and I used to take them to every year to this dance drama at the Shriram Bharati Kala Kendra, where the Ramayana, the ballet form of the epic, which was continues to be extremely popular. And so we used to go as a family every year and watch this. I was always, we loved the entertainment and it was wonderful, but I was at the end always left with this feeling of disquiet because, the way that they ended and in the ballet is when Sita is back with Ram after, the Ravan has been killed and they're playing happy families with Lakshmana and Hanuman and everything. But as adults, we know that this is not how the epic ends, that there is a very sad journey for Sita following this, that despite a great loyalty to Ram throughout her life, having never even thought of another man other than Ram, even despite that amazing loyalty and everything that she does, she is still discarded in a way. So this is something which used to trouble me. And I used to think, how do I tell this to 2 little girls growing up today, that no matter what you do within society as it is presented to us, you are never pure enough, you're never chaste enough, you're never perfect enough. There will always be something for which you will be criticized. And so I really started looking around at other ways to tell these stories. In fact, this book of mine, Song of Draupadi, was my very first manuscript, and this is what my publishers first saw. And I think if you will see most of my work, it does have this this layer, this underlying scaffolding of a natural sciences background, because I really do anchor my work in the physical reality of the time it is set in, whether it's medieval India or ancient India. I do a lot of research into the physical environment, into the birds, the animals, the food, the clothes, the texture of the place you live in.
Yes.
You see, so I do see actually that that's my natural sciences background, and I have brought it into place. I have been lucky.
Interesting.
Yes, so I was able to finally use both these things: the sciences, the research, but also the writing and the words.
Wow, that's something. I'd have to say that that's a skill of its own. Other than just writing and then your research, because just bringing it together and, putting some sense of a methodology to it in a way that, it's understood. And when you say about the physical environment, I can so relate to that. Because it's like when you're reading the books, especially like I felt that with Draupadi, I felt like, it's like a film or it's like a live performance, one is going through. So one thing it was really interesting for me is that, you have heroines or daughters of the sun, like there are these specific characters that you've identified to kind of, write about and tell their stories and bring them out and, So what is the kind of approach that goes into when you want to select a particular character? Like, is it your personal personal liking, or it's something that, you've read about in your childhood or associated with, or, how do you select these?
So to begin with, since Draupadi, Song of Draupadi was actually my first manuscript, the way in which I selected her was that I was actually looking for an antithesis to Sita. I was thinking at that time, like I was saying, the Ramayana, Sita, all this was something, at least the way that she was presented to us, Sita did not appeal to me as a role model for young girls, and I thought, what else can we tell young girls today? Are there any counterpoints to this narrative of the perfect Indian woman? And this was a time, was also around 2012. This was about 10 years ago. So it was the period of that horrifying incident of Jyoti Singh, I know, the murder of her in December in Delhi. And a lot of these things were happening. And, it sort of coalesced into this almost this feeling of anger in me that, in India, no matter what we do, no matter how perfect we are, women can still be criticized for the slightest thing, the smallest bit of clothing worn in the wrong way, this one word said incorrectly, one smile not bright enough. So I was actually filled with an enormous amount of rage for this sort of the way in which we curate our lives. We are always looking at the way we dress and the way we present ourselves, and still harm befalls us, harm befalls the daughters of India, right? In some
Yes.
form or another.
Yeah.
And so that was something which which was really really part of my psyche at that time. And today, when I read Song of Draupadi after so many years, that is actually the feeling that I'm able to tap into, is rage. It's rage against the way that we are expected to behave in a very patriarchal society. So the voice that I was able to pinpoint was Draupadi's, because really Draupadi is one of the few women in our epics who is able to channel that rage and who expresses it very, with candor, complete, with shamelessness in a sense.
Unapologetically, yes.
Unapologetically, she criticizes her husbands in the open sabha. Her mother-in-law agrees with her. So there's no excuse for her in the way that her husbands behave vis-a-vis her. So I found that extremely refreshing. At the same time, she's a woman who is vulnerable. She is human like in that sense. She has her passions that she can't control very well. She has her temper, which sometimes she struggles to control. So she's this person whom we can see evolving from the very first scene when she's getting married, her Swayamvar, where she's actually voiceless. We don't hear her saying anything in the epics. She's just presented to us like that, a perfect woman on the eve of her wedding. And the next scene we see her in is in the sabha, when she's being humiliated and she is able to express her anger, so clearly. So I was interested in this transformation of this woman. How does she go from being this voiceless bride to be, with almost at that point no mind of her own, to somebody who's able to stand up for herself? And I thought that transformation would be something which would be very inspiring to see, and would probably have a good lesson for all of us. So Draupadi came to me as very specifically an antidote to the Sita Pativat sort of persona that we have. And so, all the other characters, they sort of evolve out of this same search. In Heroines, I had a selection of 8 women, 2 from mythology and 6 from history. And I wanted a wide selection as much as possible, because my aim was to see through, say, 2000 years or 2500 years in Indian history and mythology. How have these ideas of feminine heroism changed, or have they changed at all?
Absolutely.
I wanted to give a little bit of a cross section that, okay, Mirabai, 16th century, this is how feminine heroism was presented to us. This is how it has changed vis-a-vis Hazrat Mahal, say, for example, or Amrapali, 6th century BC.
Yes.
So I wanted the reader to have a nice
range.
Yeah, a nice range, and then be able to compare and contrast to see, okay, what has happened in Indian society? How have things evolved vis-a-vis
Great. Interesting, yeah. And if I may ask that, like when you are working on a mythology character, because I mean, history is of course very factual and one knows one's boundaries, but when you're like researching a mythological character, it always kind of comes to my mind that how much freedom can one take, or how much, liberty does one take to draft that particular character for your self, So
Yeah.
how did you find?
That's a good question. And for historical figures, it's very clear in my mind, that I must be as true to the sources as possible, to the primary sources. I'm very aware of the responsibility I have towards people who have lived and died. We owe it to them to be as
Absolutely.
true, right? We cannot imagine, put ourselves into their thoughts and imagine their, motivations. And I can only offer them as alternatives, but I can't imagine myself in their lives. Whereas for mythology, I was able to do that. So I did do a lot of research, as we were talking early on, to ground the story in a physical space, which is absolutely real. All the sources I used were scholars who have studied the early Vedic times in India. So those are, you can even follow some of the recipes I've written. They're
Yes.
pretty authentic to the times. So all that has been researched, but obviously what people are feeling and thinking is something that I allowed myself the leeway to imagine, which I would not have done with a historical character. So that's why it is a work of fiction, in the sense that I have put myself in each. I cover about 10 women, 8 to 10 women, and each time I wrote about them, I thought about them for a great deal of time, what they went through, what their position was, what background they came from, what house they married into, and I really try to put myself in their place and imagine their thoughts and their motivations. So there was a very clear distinction in that sense. But to come to a subsect of your question, when I was doing this about 10 years ago, I was very when I was looking at sources, at least the epics, different people who have told us the epics, I was very careful to stick to written sources. And I feel that in some way that is part of our indoctrination, in which we are told from a Western perspective that only written sources are authentic. Today, if I were to rewrite Song of Draupadi, I would probably take into account a few more of the oral histories, which with my background in the natural sciences, I thought that's not possible. I cannot look at oral histories. I cannot look at poetry, because it's not real. It was really, I was brainwashed to a certain extent to only accept the written word, because that is how Western scholars have seen the world. But we must question that, because in India, so much of our knowledge is actually oral.
Oral, absolutely.
Right? And dance and music. And so today, I would use those sources to a much greater extent than I did earlier. And in fact, in my current work, I'm researching a lot more of sources like the ephemeral sources, if you like.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting way to treat it, because I feel like so much of our oral tradition, of course, I mean, I just feel like arts in any case, need to be preserved in every which way. But so many stories just go with people, I mean, in the dance world, we're always like, learn this from this guru, learn that from that guru, because you'll never know otherwise. It'll just go with them.
And it is part of our tradition. We have had this Guru Shishya, tradition for going back millennia. So it is something we should, for example, I was going through my notes when I was preparing for the launch of Song of Draupadi. And one of my unused notes was a wonderful anecdote that comes to us through one of the oral sources, where Duryodhan's wife, Bhanumati, she sees Draupadi, and she's like, Draupadi has come with her 5 husbands, and they're all a little bit sneering towards Draupadi. Why do you have 5 husbands? How do you manage with 5 husbands? So she makes a remark to Draupadi, about her 5 husbands. And Draupadi replies saying that in my in-laws' family, it is rather a tradition to have an excess of husbands. And here she's referring not only to Kunti, with her several, different fathers of her children, but also to Ambika and Balika, and also to Satyavati. So we have this whole genealogy of women who have had more than one husband or partners, and she's so cheekily making reference to that, and that's an oral source, and I didn't use it, but I think that shows a feisty side to Draupadi, which I would probably use today.
Yes, absolutely. How interesting. I mean, if we just put these characters aside, saying, like, I mean, it's so historical, it's so much mythology, but I just feel like the way you narrate it, it's like my story or anybody else's, in contemporary times. It becomes so much more relatable,
Right.
and more interesting. I mean, one sees like this range, like you're talking about, like of the characters that you've written about. So just curious to know now, you've already mentioned that, Draupadi was your first manuscript. How long did it take you like to put this together?
So Draupadi took me a very long time, because at that time I was an unpublished writer. I mean, I wasn't a writer, I was just writing, but obviously I had no deadline and I wasn't working to a deadline, which my next books were always working to a deadline. So those were different. But this book, I was able to spend as much time as I wanted to. So I spent, I would say, about 4 or 5 years, between the thinking of it, the reading of as many, sources as I could, feminist narratives, interpretations, scholarly works. So I spent a good 4 or 5 years over Song of Draupadi.
Nice.
It is actually my
And
most polished work.
and I mean, because it's like an epic like Mahabharata, I think there's so much written about it, so much spoken about it, because I think it's just part of all of us, like we kids, we've seen it on like Doordarshan and, like which today's kids, I think, somewhat are deprived of, but we've grown up seeing these epics, and I just feel like these are like ever evolving. So, of course, because you've read so much, I was just curious to know, like, what really, what did you find most interesting? Like, which works did you find more interesting while researching on, on Draupadi?
Yes. So, I think a turning point for me in my research was when I read Iravati Karve's Yuganta. She's
Ah,
wrote it a long time ago, I think 1970, 1969, but it was still so fresh when I read her interpretation of the Mahabharata, and she wrote with so much freedom and so much passion that I thought, oh, this is allowed. Till then I wasn't sure, can I take up such a subject? Can I
hmm,
write from the women's point of view? Is there enough material? And is it, because I'm very also aware of the fact that this is a beloved text. These are dear
hmm.
beloved stories. I do not want to offend anybody. And I was like, can I actually take this on? And when I read Iravati Karve's work, I was like, okay, this has something similar has been done before, so I can also use what I think is a relevant point of view to take this forward. And that's when I thought it would be interesting. Manjot, it's very funny, but these days it seems like the world is reflecting the same point of view, because if you look at what's happening in Afghanistan today, you see the Taliban
Absolutely.
in Kabul, and what are we most worried about? It's the women and children. They pay the price always for
Yes,
men's war,
always.
always.
Hmm.
This was something that I felt very deeply, that in the Mahabharata, we are always hearing about this wonderful war, this war to end all wars, and how brave everybody is, and how they use this boon and that boon and this mantra, and but what is happening back home? What is happening with the widows? What is happening with the women? And this was something which really interested me. So I wanted to write the story almost completely bereft of the fighting, of the the lots of over interpretation that happens over the fighting, and just concentrate on how the women through the ages involved in the epic were able to shape their destinies to the extent that was possible to them within the confines of this world.
Sure, interesting. Yeah. Uh, I mean, I was talking about it earlier also, that you've maintained such a great balance in Draupadi's character, wherein she's like, of course, Sita is the other extreme, the Pativrata and the completely, pious and everything. But I just feel like Draupadi has that interesting quirkiness to her, like, she's quite strong mentally, you can tell, and but she's also fairly silent and conservative and observing what is going on in her environment. Like, how did you, like, I'm sure there was some thought process that went into like sketching this very relatable Draupadi's character to today. Tell us
Yes.
a little bit about that.
Yes. So, like I was saying earlier on, I had this feeling that from the scene of the Swayamvar, where she is presented to us as this silent, bride waiting for her destiny to unfurl, really, in a way, to the woman in the Sabha who is able to be so eloquent, so articulate, so fierce. I was wondering about her journey. And so that's why I have set the first part of the book in Draupadi's childhood, with her mother as a figure who gives her certain pointers and who is she is able to emulate later on in life. So some of those incidents are entirely fictitious. The ones with her mother, where her
Okay.
mother, reacts to her husband
Yes,
bringing,
yes, yeah.
right?
Okay.
Because I wanted to present to the reader a possibility of women, girls learning from their mothers. And so often, if
Hmm.
you have a strong woman, she has learned this from the women in her life. There's this almost handing of the baton of a way of being when you're a woman. You have to see it somewhere in your environment. So I thought a lot about the early part of Draupadi's life, and I also wanted people to understand how women in those societies were able to gain the knowledge that they had, because Draupadi was a very, very erudite and knowledgeable woman. She was also called a Pandita. Yudhishthir, at one point, when he is trying to control her, actually, he says, "You are this Pandita. Why are you letting your anger get the better of you?" So she's known as a learned woman. So I wanted to understand how, when you were often denied a classical education as a woman, where did you get your knowledge from?
Hmm.
So in the first part, where we see her almost eavesdropping on her brother's,
Yes.
education, sitting with her father in the sabha and listening to the learned men talking to her father, exchanging points of view. There are various scenes where Draupadi is eavesdropping on
Hmm.
education. And so this is all these things with her mother, with her brothers, with the tutors. This is a way a woman was formed, in
Formed.
these indirect ways.
Hmm.
And then we get this person who in the sabha is able to argue in front of a crowd of men. They are almost only men, all her elders, and she is able to save not only herself but her husbands. And even Krishna himself says that when her husbands were drowning, Draupadi came like a ship and raised her husbands from the sea. That she was able to save them through her, her passion, her knowledge, and her self-reliance. And she
Hmm.
goes from this person who demands her right till the end, when before the battle begins. And she realizes that actually all these men, her husbands, and even Krishna, are willing to compromise with the Kauravas if they just give them one village each. In the end, they say, just give us 5 villages and we will
Yes.
drop all ideas, of a war. And she is so disgusted by this that
Hmm.
she tells, Krishna, that I have no sons, no husbands, no brothers, and even you are not really mine.
Hmm.
You are able to distance yourself from all grief and forget the fact that I have been insulted. And so this big huge arc of transformation, to the point where she comes to realize that she has none of these men are any good actually to her in defending her honor.
Hmm.
She has to depend on herself. So this journey of realization and how she comes about and where she gets the self assurance and the knowledge to be able to say that, that's a powerful thing to say, in an age,
Absolutely.
yeah, that my husbands are nothing, my sons are nothing, my father is nothing. I
Yeah.
only have myself. So this was something that really intrigued me about Draupadi.
Very nice. And of course, amongst such a large body of work on women, I mean, one sees that you've written a beautiful book on Akbar, you know. Of course, Akbar, is more enlightened or more interesting of the lot, so becomes, but what were the thoughts that brought you to put down that book on Akbar?
So, with Daughters of the Sun, which was the book that I wrote just before Akbar, I had looked at all the women of the Mughal Empire, about 200 years, from Babur to Aurangzeb. Um, and considering I had written all these books on, women in Indian history, I had this feeling that there was a danger that all these books and all my writing would be put into this convenient niche, which was women's stories.
Ah.
And that is just another way of, lessening the importance of a woman's voice. And you say, yeah, these stories are for women. The women will listen to them, women will read them, and that's what they're good for. And I thought, this is happening everywhere. And there's, I think, a general awakening to the fact that women have been written out of global histories. There was this wonderful book called Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez, where she shows that women are not even used in the data gathering system around us. The male body, the male point of view is considered the normal and the
Hmm.
the women are almost an aberration to that.
Hmm.
So it came to me that if I continue to write in this vein, then these books will just be classified as women's stories and devalued in a certain way, considered less transgressive. So I began to think that I should just write history. It shouldn't be hers or his, it is history. And whoever is important in that time, everybody should be written about. So when I decided to write about Akbar, because he was the one I knew most about, since I had studied, all the women around him,
Hmm.
I
Yes.
thought I'd write about a famous man, yes, but I will bring in all the women in his life who shaped him as well, which a regular biography hasn't done. We
Hasn't
haven't,
it?
yeah, we haven't seen his timid, the women in his life, the timid grandmother, the timid sister,
Hmm.
his mother, how she joins the court, what an important role Harka Bai has also. Um, and so I thought it would be very interesting how the harem was created around Akbar, how it
Hmm.
transformed under his reign. So my aim from now onwards really is to write about history and to include all the characters within that history without saying it is a man's story or it is a woman's story. They are both equally relevant and should be treated in the same way.
Sure. Um, yeah. And tell us like a little bit like as far as the book on Akbar is concerned, like how do you think it's that you tried to tell the story? Of course, I understand when you say that you brought around the women around in his life and in his court, but as far as he's concerned, because one has read that so much about him being this progressive leader of his times, and of course there are few things that gets you thinking, like during his times, like these women that were in the court got these specific titles, and their actual names were just kind of put underground. So it's interesting. The contrast is interesting in the personality.
It
So
is.
tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, that was something very interesting to me as well, in that he was very progressive in certain ways where women were concerned. He raised the marriageable age of girls and boys, to 16, 14 and 16, I believe. He was very disapproving of sati, even though he didn't completely outlaw it because a lot of his main courtiers were Hindu. He didn't want to offend them, but he tried to dissuade them wherever possible. He encouraged remarriage of widows. He was very shocked that widows were not allowed to remarry in the Hindu culture, So he tried to work against that. So he was very progressive for a 16th century, monarch. And yet we find that so many of the women around him, were hidden behind titles, and you were not allowed
Hmm.
to say their names. They were considered, much beyond the scope of ordinary men and women. And so I wanted to understand a bit of that. And I think a lot of it came through the interaction between Akbar and the Rajput courts as well. And in
Okay.
the middle, Abu al Fazl. Now, the Rajput courts were courts where the veiling of women had been happening in elite cultures. And in fact, the more elite you were, the greater the parda around the women. So, the greater, the higher the walls and the smaller the windows and the more opaque the parda. So your women, if you were very elite, then your women were almost completely kept within parda. And this was a system that Akbar was introduced to very young because he married a Rajput princess as
Hmm.
a very young man. She came she kept her religion and she brought her whole entourage from Amer to the Mughal court. So she brought her singers, her dancers, her cooks, her priests, everything, all this little sliver of Rajput life entered the harem, if you like. And Akbar was exposed, many of his great courtiers, Raja Man Singh, etc., were all Rajput as well. So he was heavily influenced by
Hmm.
Rajput thought and vice versa. So you have this, wonderful time in the end of the 16th century where there's this mix of cultures in the Rajput and the Mughals.
How nice. Yeah.
So I think that Akbar was heavily influenced by this idea of the veiling of women, of keeping the women hidden in a certain sense. And then Abu al-Fazl, who writes his biography, he makes it even more so, because for him, Akbar is the perfect man. So the women in his life must never be even mentioned by name, and so in his biography, only ever mentions them by their titles. And so little by little, their origins become more obscure, their names become obscured, and you forget about them as individuals. You see them as these glowing figures, Maryam Uzmani or Maryam Magani. And so these are the sort of factors which come into the making of the myths that is Akbar and the women in his life, whereas he himself was a much more pragmatic man. In the way I describe it, you see that he actually has to be very careful about the women, what they think. If they disapprove of something he does, he waits till they're away on a journey before trying to do anything, because otherwise he knows he won't be allowed to do that. So actually in day-to-day life, these women are extremely powerful, and he has to cater to their likes and dislikes. But in the writing, in the biographies, in Abu al-Fazl's work, these women are slowly, completely, written out of the narrative as human beings. They are just there as these goddesses, if you like.
I know. I mean, one just feels like, I mean, what were those times? Quite crazy, to think of those times like this. But to come to that, I was just observing, like, the covers of your book are so interesting, also traditional, but I just found like Draupadi's cover is so strong and stark. Like, what was the thought behind it, and who designed it for you?
So, this is ever from Daughters of the Sun onwards, I have a lot of, I'm very interfering in the covers. I have a very strong point of view in what the covers should look like. But I worked with the Aleph team, and they are the ones who came up with it. Bina Sareen, who works, on the design, she contacted an independent, person who designed this for us. And of course, they gave her very clear, we talked about it for a long time. I wanted a very stark image of Draupadi, because it really, the story centers around her. There are many other women I talk about, but of course, she is really the backbone of the story. And, I wanted the color red because red is so important in her life. So many times she's associated with blood,
Yes.
and she uses it very powerfully, whether for vengeance or for her own humiliation. Blood is very strong.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wanted the red, and I wanted her to look not like this very happy goddess type person that is often presented, but to look angry. So given these few pointers, they came up with this
Very
outcome.
interesting, I have to say. I mean, you must compliment
Yes.
your team that it just gets you thinking, because you're going back to an epic, a very mythological character, and then there is this very interesting cover, which is very nice. Now I'll come to this pandemic that has hit upon us. And one sees that, someone like you, like Akbar came out last year, Draupadi's come out this year. And as much as I'm a person who's been doing live events for like 20 years now, I find this digital space, I mean, one has to cope with it, but not really the best. But yeah, but tell us a little bit about how you're coping with this challenge at the moment.
Yeah, so it isn't ideal, I have to say, but books are years in the making, and often are planned almost a year in advance. So for Akbar, we had planned, say in 2019, we knew that okay, by summer of 2020, Akbar will be out. Not knowing that by March there would be a pandemic. So things were already set in motion before we could do anything about Akbar. So it wasn't by choice, really. I would not have planned it like this, because it is extremely hard to have a book out there in the middle of a pandemic, obviously. But anyhow, it happened like that. And then Draupadi followed, because we really thought by this year things would be a lot better, and we are still doing Zoom events, you see. So it of course it has its advantages, in the sense that life goes on and we are able to do these things. We're able to have launches, and I'm able to connect to some extent. with people, but really it is far from ideal because, like for so many artists, even writers need that physical contact, with the other people, to have that interaction, that give and take with readers, to sign books, to chat to people. It's been a very different, a brave new world, really. But I think this is the way it will partly continue to be. We may also have physical events coming back, but I think we've come very far on the e-platform and the e-space to go back completely. So I think this will become part of the way in which we engage with the world.
Yeah, that I also feel like, I mean, I've grown up with like a physical book in my hand, like it's very difficult for me to like open it on a, open the book on even a PDF on a computer or a Kindle or whatever and go through, because I feel like, just the pleasure of shutting it and putting that bookmark in and okay, leaving that story where you left it and then going back to it, I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts about this? I know it's there to stay and that's the future, like, but just the idea of ebooks versus like the physical book in your hand,
Yeah. So I think there's a case to be made for both, really. There's a space for both. Like I use the Kindle when I'm traveling because it's so much more convenient. I can carry hundreds of books in my Kindle, whereas I could possibly carry one or two in my suitcase. So it's very good at certain times. But I think physical books are actually more resilient than we realize. And what's wonderful is, at least in the West, I don't know how India has done, but hopefully well as well. In the West, a lot of independent local bookstores have actually done very well. And as soon as lockdown ended, people made a point to go out to their local neighborhood bookstores and browse and pick up books, and as you were saying, get that smell of new books again, and that feel of a book in your hand. And they've actually supported their local bookstores. So I think there will always be a space for physical books as well. For children, for example, is wonderful to have the images as well. For and history
Nice.
books like mine, in which I have a lot of images, it's great to have.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think we are expanding the range of both these kinds of books, and I think both will remain. I don't think one is going to wipe out the other.
Okay, now as we're going to just kind of very little time, but tell me one thing, that if you go back to Draupadi, which is your recent work, like, is there anything that you feel want to not change, but like, sometimes you feel like, okay, I wish I had like done this differently or kind of approached this, or, like things that you feel like maybe I could have, added more to it. Like, do you feel like that? Like,
As we were speaking earlier on, that this book came from a particular space. How we all have, threshold moments in our life which change us very profoundly. Sometimes it's a bereavement that changes us for life. Sometimes having a child changes you for life. We have these big things that happen to us. So at that time in my life, with what I was, going through with my the young children, like I was talking to you about, the sort of anger that I was experiencing around the way women were treated, the 2012 incident in Delhi. I had a lot of this frustration and rage about being a woman in India. So this book actually really does capture the feelings that I was having at that time and what I wanted to convey to people. So in a way, this book exercised those demons of mine, and I find that my later books have a much more light touch to them. They have more humor in them, and I was able to do that because I wrote this book first. If I hadn't written it, I may have been carrying those demons a little longer. So I don't think I would have done things very differently. I spent a lot of time on it, and I thought very deeply around it. As I was saying, I may have just included a little more of the oral material that I found. Yeah. A few of the oral traditions to perhaps flesh out some of these, people.
sure.
But otherwise, I think I'm pretty satisfied even today with the way I've written.
Good. Because sometimes you're like, I mean, that's also a very, it's a satisfactory feeling that, okay, this is it, which is a very nice thing. And tell us what you're working on at the moment, a little bit.
So,
if you don't mind.
yeah, sure, of course, something very different now. So, I am working on the late 18th century in Awadh, essentially the court of Asafuddaula in Lucknow, but
Okay.
also Bahu Begum, his mother, in Faizabad. So, at this time, you have the Nawab of Awadh, who is Asafuddaula, who's just inherited from Shujauddaulah, but he's facing this almost counterculture from his mother and grandmother in Faizabad. So, you have these two distinct court cultures, and so, how Asafuddaula manages in the face of not only the English who are slowly encroaching upon his sovereignty, but also his mother who also encroaches upon his sovereignty. And what happens, between all these cultures and how the Europeans are involved, because they were actually very important at this time in the art. So in the miniature paintings, the French have quite a strong influence, which we have forgotten about now. And so their role, their involvement, and how this effervescent brought out some of the wonderful culture of Lucknow as we know it today.
How nice, interesting, lovely. Urvi, do we have more time? Can I continue chatting or you want to take questions?
You can continue chatting. In the meantime, we'll just get people to send in their questions or raise their hands. Maybe we take questions after 5-7 minutes.
Okay, okay. So another thing I wanted to like I was telling you the other day when we spoke briefly, that the whole book Draupadi feels like there's so much of physical space that you have kind of defined very interestingly. I was literally feeling like at many times I felt like it was a live performance or like a show that one is watching, like stark visuals come in front of you. Like how did you get into this space? Like one is the character and then one is the space around the character, like the kind of research that went into it and the kind of stuff you had to go, like to be knowing like how people were changing medicines when seasons were changing, logo ki nazar kaise utar rahi thi,
Right.
all that. Like this is like really getting into deep detail of everything of that time. Tell us a little, how did you approach that?
So I knew from the beginning that this was the way I was going to write the book. I wanted it to feel like a physically true story that could have that the person reading it can be transported to that time. In fact, I hope with all my books I have tried to do that. But even for the Vedic age, I wanted it to feel like something that people could feel familiar with. That they said, "Oh yes, this is our environment. This is our climate." Because I often feel that when I read books set in India, that there is not enough of that. We read up, for example, with such a strong knowledge of some of the European writers, like we know what a European summer feels like, we know what winter feels like, in Europe, because we are so acclimatized to that writing that sometimes we don't anchor our books in that strong reality. Summer, for example, I wanted to write a lot about mangoes and how they are so important to us in the summer. How we are
Yes.
obsessed with mangoes. It becomes,
Yes.
obsession. So I knew that there were these few things. And then as I did my research, as you pointed out, I found out things like how important superstition was, how a lot of life was guided by superstition. If there was a crow at your door, you would not leave your door that morning, you would stay home.
Yeah.
So I wanted people to remember that this was a time where there were a lot of fears around, a lot of superstition. So you needed a lot of magic almost, to counter all of that. And the mantras that you had, and as you were saying, also the medicines and the cosmetics. This was huge. There was a huge body of knowledge that often the women had. They were custodians of that knowledge, and how they pass it on to each other, how they recite these recipes to each other so that it's memorized. I wanted people to have a sense of that, that when the climate changed from, say, summer to monsoon, then immediately you would throw out certain oils, you would throw out certain cosmetics, and you would bring in the next set of cosmetics, which was exactly correct for that time of the year. And how specific and detailed these things were, all this knowledge which is lost to us today in our world where everything is the same all year round, with the AC and the heater, you hardly feel it, So I wanted people to get this very visceral literal sense of living from month to month, from climate to climate, and how people coped with that and reacted to that. So that was clear to me from the beginning. And as I discovered more of these layers, I went into more of the scholarship, because luckily a lot of people have done work on the early Vedic times and the
Yes.
times of the epic. So that knowledge is available to us. I just had to find a way to string it into the narrative so that it seemed part, effortlessly part of the story, and not like a lecture that I'm having to give somebody about this is how the climate was like. I wanted people to just discover it accidentally. So that's how I did. I spent a lot of time looking at that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, because, it was a lot of ancient wisdom, like how we, today there's a lot of research in any case going into the natural way of life, going back to herbs and spices and, living that life. So very interestingly put into the book as part of the narrative, I really found that interesting. Now I'm coming back to Akbar. What just something that's always interested me is that, I mean, even in the miniature paintings, we see a lot of elephants as part of his life, and also because your cover is a very interesting work that you chose. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. So Akbar was, interested in elephants from the time he came to Hindustan. So the story is that in Kabul, the biggest animal he had ever seen was the camel. So he used to spend a lot of time with camels, learning about them, making them go as fast as possible, seeing what they could eat, for example. And when he came to Hindustan with Humayun, he was fascinated by the elephants. He had never seen them before. And so from the age of 13, 14, he became very interested in this animal, which he found at the same time was an incredibly powerful animal, but also an animal he found that could control its temper, control its violence, and obey the rider, you see. So he, in fact, saw himself as reflected in these qualities, as somebody who was very powerful, but who must control that power for the good of the empire. So you see, he sort of saw himself mirrored in the qualities of the best elephants of his that he possessed, and he loved his elephants dearly. He knew all of them by name.
Absolutely, yes.
And he used them, he used them for psychological warfare, because he would take them across the country, this whole army of 500 war elephants with their armor and their spikes and their swords tied to their trunks and all that. And he would terrorize his opponents. Oftentimes they would run away or give in before they even went to battle. So he understood the visual power of elephants as well. And then physically he used to ride musk elephants. So you can imagine how he had to work on himself to be able to do that. A musk elephant is a very, very deranged animal, right? And he had to learn to control this animal. And in a way, because Akbar didn't have a classical education, he did not learn to read and write in the classical way. He learned through experience. He learned by interacting with the world in a very immediate way. So these elephants, I think they taught him a lot about the nature of power, of control, of bringing that temper and that power under control to achieve great things. So the elephant was very important to him.
Yeah, very important. Ulvi wants to take questions now. Ulvi, go ahead.
Thanks, Manjot. Thank you, Ira. Mansi, will you just get the first person in?
Right. So we have two people who have raised their hands. So can we have Shiv, please?
Hi, Ira.
Hi, Shiv.
Yeah, it was a very interesting, conversation, and I mean about Draupadi, and you had a lot of incisive, about Satyavati, Amba, Ambalika, and which many people don't know. And unfortunately, because of time, I think those things could have been highlighted more in this discussion rather than being very evasive. So anyway. There would be 2-3 questions I would like to take your incisive opinion on, and a little academic opinion on, and how do you reflect it in the book? Actually, I've not read your book, my apologies, but definitely I'd like to read your book. So what is your take on the incident where Draupadi mocks Duryodhan during the Indraprasth, when she goes there and she calls him, you're a son of a blind person, and that's why that is one of the other reasons why, whatever happens later on, so that's one instance. And the second is the Krishna Draupadi Samvad, which happens after the Mahabharat war has happened, and there she says that, Sakha, you've done, you're God, you could have done so much, you could have saved my kids and so much, So Krishna there says very nicely, because as you rightly said, there was rage. And, the backdrop when you wrote the book, there was a lot of rage in your mind regarding the incidences which happened. But Krishna very beautifully says that uncontrolled rage leads to destruction. So Draupadi, you have also been part of that uncontrolled rage, So just like any biological processes, you're a science student, there's so many machineries. Any kind of rage goes uncontrolled leads ultimately to destruction. So that is also one part of Draupadi's, life, apart from, and the significance of the red color, as you rightly said. And a little more academic view into whether Duryodhan and Kauravas were actually Suyodhans. Because has the history been, or mythology written for the victor or the vanquished, so to say. So nobody keeps his son's name Duryodhan, Suyodhan, there's a beautiful Hindi plays also on the particular subject, So I've asked you a lot of questions maybe, but I want your opinions on these. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your interest in the epics, So about Duryodhan and I obviously had to choose and select certain incidents that I wanted highlighted, that I thought would show the evolution of Draupadi, of not just Draupadi, but as you've rightly said, many of the women. We haven't had time today to talk about many of the others, but Satyavati is a very important woman in my book, Become Balika also. And Kunti was also extremely important. So what I wanted to show about Draupadi is her anger, her uncontrolled anger, as you say, which shows her human-like qualities. That she is a passionate woman who sometimes just speaks her mind, perhaps when she shouldn't. So I have shown that when she laughs at Karan in the in Indraprastha when he steps into the water, but I have not overemphasized those things, because sometimes I feel that in the epics, as you know, how the epic was written over centuries, and sometimes you have these core incidents happening, and then you have the sort of overlaying of history over that. So you will have a further Brahmin who reflects on the incidents and gives a few more thoughts on it. And what I think happens over time, over the centuries of, after all, when we talk about women's point of view, the Mahabharata has been written about by men. So even the women, when we talk about them, it's actually an act of ventriloquism. It is men writing what women are saying. So it's not truly women's voices. So what I wanted to do was remove whatever I thought were the extra layers of men commenting on women's actions, to try to get to that core action, if you like, to see how it affected the following actions. Because often I found when a woman did something, then you would have a long lecture on why that was wrong, why that shouldn't have been done, including why, Draupadi being very angry, that was not something to do. But then if you look at, say, how someone like Kunti reinforces this view. For example, Draupadi addresses Yudhishthira and calls him a eunuch for not doing his duty as a Kshatriya. And Kunti, again, towards the end of the epic, when they are thinking of suing for peace and settling for just a few villages, Kunti says the same thing to her son and tells Krishna, please send him this message, that if he does not take up arms to fight for his birthright, then he is less than a Kshatriya, then he is a eunuch. She uses the same words. And she said it is better to rise up for an instant, and flare for an instant, than to live the rest of your life like a crawling insect. So I am a little suspicious about the layers of interpretation, especially where they come to address women's actions. And women's actions are, again, constantly scrutinized and criticized, whereas you see another woman will reinforce that same point of view. So I don't look for, I try not to theorize for too long over what is the right or the wrong.
De do, please.
But I am just trying to stick to the fundamental of how these women have acted, why they acted the way they did, what was the driving motivation of their action, and what it led to. I try and not digress too much into the theorizing of it. So I've just given you a broad answer, but just for sake of time, that's the gist of it.
Thank you, Ira. So there have been a couple of other questions. Uh, One is that the archetype, the stereotype, and the specific, they've all been considered in your portrayal. If so, how has this been dramatized? And we have a lot of requests for the covers, the beautiful covers of your book. Everybody wants to see them. Um, so yeah, everybody here is the cover of Draupadi.
Sorry, the question, I'm not sure I got that, Urvi.
Right. The archetype, the stereotype, and the specific, they've all been considered in your portrayal. So, if so, then how has this been dramatized? What has been your interpretation? I think that's something that somebody wants to know.
Okay. Um, how is my interpretation different? Maybe is that what they want to know, that there have been other takes on the I'll just take it as that sort of question. I think my take has been to stay away from the classics, the scenes that we are all very familiar with, the disrobing of Draupadi, the all the many battle scenes, and I have just looked at it from beginning with Ganga, through Satyavati, Kunti, Ambika, Ambalika, all the women, how they are affected, and how, I think oftentimes when we look at the Mahabharata, sometimes we forget that a lot of the action is to do over ownership of women's wombs. Really, a lot of the action is generated because there's uncertainty and anxiety over who. Which child a woman is carrying, whose child she's carrying, and what they will turn out to be. Right from the time of Ganga, who has Vyas before she marries, Shantanu, up to Kunti and her sons, Ambika, Ambalika, and their children. So we often have, and Satyavati. So oftentimes we forget that a lot of the action is driven by this anxiety over the ownership of women's womb. So what I have wanted to put back into the spotlight, if you like, is how these women negotiated this very difficult condition of sometimes being treated as nothing more than wombs, and how they were able to influence their destiny despite that. So you see somebody like Satyavati, who had Vyas when she had no control over over that incident. She was not even married. She had a son. How does she use this event, the fact of having a son later in life, when her own her sons through marriage are dying and they're not able to have their own children? She calls this first son and uses him to impregnate her daughters-in-law. So she uses this unfortunate incident that happens early in her life to influence her future life. So this is the sort of action that I want to show, the things that happen behind the battles, before the battles, this huge sort of, push and pull that happens over the ownership of women's wombs, and how women are nonetheless trying to control their destiny, even in this setup, which I have not changed, this very, very tightly, rigidly patriarchal setup, how women react to this.
Thank you so much, Ira. So we have one more question. Do you think people reading your stories would be made interested into rereading of history or historical text? Or do you think it would just raise a nostalgic feeling for the times that have gone by, like the feeling that we have for fantasy stories or fictitious stories when we read?
Yeah, that's a good question, really. I think the aim of most of us who are writing narrative histories nowadays, and there are quite a few people who are doing this, uh, is to make people interested in histories which are accessible. A lot of us have had our only exposure to history was in a pretty dry format in school. Even in colleges, we have great professors, but in school, it's often pretty dry and told to us in a way which does not engage our imagination. So we leave it at that. But people, and we are finding more and more, are actually very interested in history. So I think that when it's told in an engaging and accessible manner, it it really excites people. And I think they then go on to want to know more. I mean, certainly people who have read, for example, Daughters of the Sun have told me that we had no idea that women had this sort of power, that, Mughal women were able to do these sort of things. They were traders, they owned ships, they had money. We want to know more about that. So yes, I do think that not nostalgia, but people have this feeling of being cheated of their histories. I know that I certainly felt that when I found out all this material about Mughal women, that I, growing up in Delhi, had not been taught these things, that so many of these buildings were built by Mughal women. I felt cheated, and I said, these are things which should be taught to young people. They should know these things so that, they can make informed choices in their life about different things.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have one last question that we'll be taking, which is, was it difficult for you to find authentic accounts of women during the Mughal Empire or from our epics, and how effective it is to tell history through a female perspective per se?
I have been asked this question so many times, and everyone assumes that those histories are not there, those sources are not there, but actually they are there. They are just ignored. Women's voices, not just in India, but globally. We always consistently ignore women's contributions. I mean, this is a phenomenon that is, I think, more and more being realized. I think there is even there's a thing called the Gage effect from a woman called Matilda Gage, who in the late 19th century said that all scientific discoveries made by women are actually credited to their male co-writers or some men in their life, and the women get forgotten. And this is still called the Gage effect, that whatever women do in the sciences, in the arts, in literature, it is forgotten, or it is obliterated, or it is handed over to a convenient male figure. So the fact is that these histories exist, even for Mughal women. I was told you will never find sources for Mughal women. It may not be presented in the same format as it is for men. So I don't have a nice, easy history to access. Sometimes I have to look at buildings, I have to look at calligraphy, I have to look at miniature paintings, I have to look at inscriptions on buildings, I have to look at farmans, orders by women. It takes a bit more effort. It takes a bit of detective work, but those sources are there, and there's enough material to put together to write hundreds of histories of women. It's just that the motivation should be there, and the patience has to be there, and you need to want to find those sources.
Super. Thank you, Ira. Would you have time for one more question? We've just had someone raise their hand.
Yeah, sure.
Sukant, Mansi, would you unmute Sukant?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good evening.
Hi, good evening.
A small suggestion. I mean, Rajasthan has had a very, very rich oral tradition in the form of songs and tales.
Correct.
Which has been lost, and we have lost most of the local histories of this area.
Absolutely.
And we have had fantastic traditions of very brave queens, very brave women. And it's a subject that someone should research on and try and save the losing tradition. I mean, we have lost most of it, but if you can save it, it'll be fantastic.
That's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you, Sukant. I know that when I was researching Akbar, I came across Alison Bush's work. Very sadly, she passed away, but the young scholar who's done a lot of work on these scripts, on the written work, legacies. Yes, but the oral histories also are worth saving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I know this will keep going on and on and on. We can keep talking to Ira forever. It's just so interesting to listen to her. But we've got to end this. Thank you so much, Ira. Thank you, Manjot. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I am so glad I was able to listen in on this. Before I let all of you go, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And thank you to all our partners, Prabhakatan Foundation, Shri Cements, SAS Women, and the Spagia Foundation. Thank you once again for joining us. We'll keep letting you know about the next sessions coming in, and we hope to see you there again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Urvi.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Manju.